Lawmakers here in Washington are working around the clock to pass a massive funding bill to keep the government open through the fall. The bill includes billions in aid for Ukraine, among other key provisions. Our congressional correspondent Lisa Desjardins is back with more on this and other news brewing on Capitol Hill. Lisa, hello, welcome back to the studio.
Right.
For a change. So another whirlwind day, I guess you could say, in Washington. You do have this big government spending bill worked out overnight, only to hit a snag today. That was overcome. But tell us, what is in this bill, some of that, and why is it so important?
Judy, this is a mega bill. It's called the Omnibus for a reason. Our Latin scholars out there know why. It includes everything. This is the way government touches the American people's lives the most. I want to take people through some broad strokes of this bill. We can't possibly cover it all, but in general, this bill is $1.5 trillion. It's the annual spending bill, but there's also increases in it, more increases for defense and non-defense, and for the first time that we've seen in well over a decade, earmarks have returned. We've reported on that. That is in this bill that is slated for passage. Also in here that you heard that you talked about the ambassador with earlier, $13.6 billion for Ukraine. Half of that is military funding. Another roughly half is more humanitarian and diplomatic. Also in here, another big issue, $1.5 billion for shoring up the southern border. So you can see this is a big ticket item. It covers a lot of issues. There was an issue earlier today with the COVID money that was in this, about $15 billion, mainly for vaccines, medicines. How do you pay for that was the issue. Because of that debate, that has been separated out into another bill. I think we're going to be talking about that more in the future. Its fate is unknown. But tonight, we do expect this large package to move forward. How long it takes, we don't know. But we think government will not shut down and this bill will become law likely.
So I was hearing it's more than 2,500 pages. You've actually been reading it.
Yes.
Tell us more about what else it does.
There's so much. I would love to just spend hours taking people through. It really tells you what government does. And a few items to highlight here that I want to talk about. This bill would renew the Violence Against Women Act, a big deal. That's the first time in nearly a decade that that act has been renewed by Congress. Also, it addresses the immigrant visa backlog with hundreds of millions in new spending to try and deal with that problem. It also contains the largest increase in funding for the IRS since 2001, almost the largest increase this century. And it also has some small things with big meaning. For example, this directs that there must be a plaque placed on the west front of the Capitol to honor the police who fought there on January 6th. It covers items big and small. It has a major effect in what this country does and how Congress sees this country.
It's a lot of different important issues that are wrapped up in one place. It's not the only piece of important legislation, though, to pass this week. Significant Postal Service reform. Tell us some of what that is in that legislation. Well,
first of all, to remind people, I know Jeff Bennett's reported on this, why we have a problem with the Postal Service. So the Postal Service last year actually increased its revenue. It's making more money. However, if you look at the numbers, they're losing money overall. They're losing more money than they're bringing in. So in fact, last year it was a net loss of almost $5 billion. The key issue for them, Judy, has been pension funding. They have been required by Congress to fund pensions ahead of time. No other agency has to do this. So when you look at the workers of the Postal Service, it's some 650,000 people. We all know what they look like. We all see them in our lives. Yes. Their jobs have been on the line and whether they could actually deliver the mail 6 days a week. That was a question for the Postal Service. This reform bill that passed the Senate this week goes to the president's desk, actually says that saves about $50 billion for the agency by changing how the pension system works and diverting many of those workers to the Medicare system instead. And it keeps our 6-day delivery system intact.
So much there.
Yes.
And Lisa, one more significant bill went to the president's desk this week, and that is the Emmett Till anti-lynching measure. Tell us what is in that.
Right, and first, thanks to our viewers for hanging in. This is a lot of information, but this is all very important stuff that doesn't get attention all the time. This bill, the Emmett Till anti-lynching bill, of course, is named for the 14-year-old victim of a murder lynching in 1950s in Mississippi. And this is something, the idea that a lynching should be a federal crime, has been debated for 100 years. But this week it passed and made its way to the president's desk, and I want to talk a little bit about what it actually does. It would make lynching, it defines lynching essentially as a conspiracy that results in a violent hate crime. So some people say The Ahmaud Arbery death in Georgia could be considered a lynching, for example, under this law, a federal hate crime, federal lynching. And it applies to race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or disability status. This was overwhelmingly passed by both chambers, a bipartisan vote, something, as I say, that has been in the air for a century, took a long time to do, and now it's going to the president, which should be law soon.
You take notice when legislation passes and when there is bipartisan agreement.
That's right.
Bipartisan agreement among congressional appropriations has the United States finally on the verge of a fiscal 2022 budget, one featuring the $782 billion Omnibus bill for national defense and an additional $13.6 billion in aid for the Ukraine. John Tester, a Democrat out of Montana, said at the McClaskey conference today, "I'm proud of this package. We approved and responded to Putin's unprovoked war in Ukraine." Included in that national defense total is $728.5 billion for the Department of Defense, $13.5 billion more than the department had asked for when its budget request rolled out in late May of 2021. The appropriators agreement comes nearly 6 months after the fiscal year began, meaning current programs are operating under last year's funding. New programs have been unable to begin. The new legislation largely increases the Pentagon's procurement and research and development accounts, allocating $119 billion in research, development, test, and evaluation funding, up $7 billion from the department's request, and $12 billion above the fiscal year 2021 enacted. It also allocates about $145 billion for procurement, in which $12.4 billion above the budget request and $8.4 billion above last year's appropriation. Pentagon Comptroller Michael McCord said, "We were expecting that," referring to the bump in the RT and E procurement funding. The omnibus legislation comes after nearly 6 months of continuing resolutions that led defense leaders to warn Congress of major program delays if the government was forced to operate under a CR for a full year. Earlier on Wednesday morning, Representative Mike Turner, a Republican out of Ohio, and ranking member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and House Armed Services Committee, happily said the bill looks relatively like a Republican defense bill. The omnibus, which still needs to be passed by both chambers and signed into law amidst fights over non-defense dollars, provides substantial increases for several programs. The bill will give the U.S. Navy $226.7 billion to buy 13 new ships, $4.1 billion above that request. The Army receives increases in funding for several older platforms, as service officials have been sounding the alarm that future budget requests will have to make tough sacrifices to meet its modernization goals. The department had asked for $10 billion for Ukraine, McCord said. Less than $13.6 billion appropriations have lined up as a response to Russia's invasion. Tester argued that it was important to get the funding bill through quickly without obstruction. He went on to say, "The potential for this thing in Ukraine blowing up, will make you not sleep at night, if you think about it." McCord praised Congress for finally releasing the bill and including the Ukraine aid, saying that President Joe Biden's State of the Union address showed strong bipartisan support for Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. "We are seeing that in the supplemental," McCord had said. Defense leaders at the McClaskey conference on Wednesday praised the Ukrainian aid package, with McCord calling the bill a show of strong support for Ukraine. And Army Secretary Christine Wormuth dubbed it pretty healthy. Yeah, pretty healthy indeed. But the United States isn't the only one with a bloated defense budget. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has just committed to a $100 billion to defense spending, in which the move was widely touted as a strong response to Russian aggression. But it's actually more about showing Germany's fealty to U.S. global foreign policy objectives. In truth, however, the budget increase constitutes a fitting continuation of the style of the country, a momentary concession to domestic and international sentiment, political symbolism, and sending a signal with the goal of setting an example. What does this mean for the rest of us? If we have a bloated budget for the Department of Defense in which no agency on earth or entity on this earth spends more than the Pentagon. Well, Veronica Degrade, who wrote for Reason 2 days ago, in which she stated that providing military defense is a valid function of the federal government. However, that doesn't give license to Congress to simply pile on more spending, even when there are dangers out there. Nor does it mean that even more spending will result in a completely safe world for us Americans. That's in part because that world, doesn't exist. There's only so much safety money can buy. And while Veronica doesn't pretend to know about what the optimal budget for our military is, we are already spending a large amount on national security and on the Pentagon. And I did a video about this last year, just a couple of months ago, about an appropriations bill for the Department of Defense. But in the fiscal year 2023, the United States is expected to spend more than $770 billion on the national defense. Now, this enormous sum, and I'm using that term lightly, enormous, I think it's grossly obese sum, is more than the next 10 countries spend combined. For example, Russia spends close to 62 billion. France and Germany spend almost about 53 billion each. And assuming China's numbers are accurate, it spends about 252 billion. Nowhere near the 770 billion for the United States. Now, according to Veronica's article, when considering how much money we think is worth spending, we must keep in mind that not every additional dollar military spending will result in enhanced national security. That's because government intentions do not equal results. Elected officials and bureaucrats have weak incentives to sensibly manage tax dollars. They are not rewarded for maximizing taxpayer value, nor are they usually punished for unnecessary risks. In addition, interest groups often drive political decisions that run counter to the best interests of the public. And that's the best sentence of our article. And that's actually true. Now, for you people who continue to vote, which is a losing proposition, on to you, the voter, you'll notice that there are left and right issues when it comes to education, when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to Social Security, when it comes to the important issues relating to everyday life of the American taxpayer. But there is no partisanship when it comes to the foreign lobby institutes of, say, Israel or the Gulf, that's Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, or when it comes to the fossil fuel industry, Enron, Chevron, or when it comes to the international global pipelines, or when it comes to the military industrial complexes and private military industrialists like LG3 Technologies, Raytheon, Boeing, or when it comes to the banking industry, the International Monetary Foundation, the World Economic Forum, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs. And of course, to the 1%, those who are grossly rich, the billionaire class. All of these entities, every last one of them, including the private industry firms, do not care about the welfare, the safety of the American constituents. Now, in order to push this further, allow me to go over some of the issues that this country has when it comes to the public sector, such as healthcare. Now, when it came to the current crisis with COVID, the pandemic, the Hill article dated last year, wrote that the current patchwork of federal institutions, namely the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the Food and Drug Administration, and the National Institute of Health, was simply not designed for a crisis like this one. And I find that to be hypocritical. They are designed for a crisis like this one, and that's the essence of these entities. The Centers for Disease and Control and Prevention are an institution that is well aware, well met, and designed to meet a pandemic. So I disagree with the part of the article, as well as the lack of coordination among them has manifested in dangerous ways, from conflicting public guidelines to direct interagency conflicts. Well, that's true. We have too many inept, too much malfeasance, too many lies, too many falsehoods and misunderstandings, as well as disinformation. We're not getting the best of information when it comes to the national legacy media. Let's be honest here. If you're watching the news today, you are brainwashed. And that's not a slight on you. From day one of your existence, you've been brainwashed into a world that simply doesn't exist. This is indeed a matrix of sorts, where everything that's told to you, most everything, not everything, I don't want to sound a fringe conspiratorialist, most everything is not honest. It's not that it's all false, it's just not honest. And no matter where you look, when it comes from the legacy media on the TV, on the internet, the subjugation of independent news agencies like Abby Martin, RT News, because you don't agree with their politics or their viewpoints, is not going to make them go away. You're just going to make them more fervent, more driven to continue, instead of having a conversation, which is what rational people do. But this dysfunction has not only stymied our response to the novel coronavirus, it has ultimately eroded public faith in our health institutions and in science as a whole. Now, according to recent polls, less than half of Americans trust what the CDC had said about the virus. And that's coming from one poll, which was done by the Hart Research Associates Public Opinion Strategies in January of 2022. Most of those came from the ages of 18 to 24, 60 to 64, and 75 and over. 88% of them were not Hispanic, 12% were. 75% were white, 13% black, 70% non-Hispanic. 79% were registered voters, 21% were not. And those beliefs are largely shaped by ideology rather than evidence. Now, this is true. Now, I would say that half of it. I can't tell you either a majority or a minority. I will safely say half. And that's coming from my experience of dealing with people, whether it's from the political, the religious point of view, or even a racial point of view, which I think is a very minuscule percentage. But I think it mostly comes from a conspiratorial point of view. And most fringe conspiracists are overtly religious, not spiritualists, and are nationalists or authoritarians. The fringe elements of society are more apt to believe in the extreme forms of conspiracy, which doesn't have any evidence whatsoever. I have met these people in the 9/11 circle because I'm a 9/11 researcher and I deal with these people on a daily basis. That's not an exaggeration, and it's what destroyed the truth movement in whole, our fringe conspiracies. Now, that doesn't just pertain to just 9/11. We've seen it with Sandy Hook, JFK, and of course, with just about every mass shooting after Columbine, with no help from the people like Alex Jones and Jim Fetzer, but also with coronavirus, which leads to the average American who isn't politically divisive, or someone who believes in the fringe conspiracies, or even just the official state narratives, in quite a quandary of who to believe. And that's exactly where people in power want you. They don't want you to make a decision. They want you in a paralysis, a state of paralysis, where you can't make a decision. But is this basically a left and right position when it comes to healthcare cuts? Well, for example, let's keep it recent, because I could go back decades. But let's keep it recent. One of the most proposed health cuts, which were done under the Trump administration, in which the Biden administration has not amended for the better or worse. In fact, this is not an issue that is going to be argued globally, but instead it'll be argued here in the States between the establishment Democrats as well as these repugnant GOP members or the Trump administration. I'm not going to compare him to a Republican in any traditional sense because he's not. He is indeed outside of those lines, which is the reason why the Republicans didn't like Trump, which is why he was so vilified. But what does that say about Biden? Well, he's an establishment man. He's supported by the private industrialists. And when it came to Trump, he basically was a benefactor, someone who is more inclined about making money than he is about the welfare of the people. Well, we could say that about Biden. We could say that about Chuck Schumer. And of course, any other establishment leftist like Nancy Pelosi. But 2 years ago, you had Democratic presidential candidate Julian Castro criticizing Trump's budget proposal. But he makes a connection that's just not there when it comes to budget healthcare tax cuts. Take a listen.
Julian Castro, one of the nearly 20 Democrats with eyes set on the White House, recently took aim at President Trump by highlighting a frequent Democratic talking point: healthcare. Castro tweeted that the Trump budget slashes investments in healthcare to pay for tax cuts to billionaires. A lot of Democrats have made similar arguments before. But is Castro's statement a fair assessment of the president's fiscal priorities this year? Yes and no. The Trump administration's budget proposal for fiscal year 2020 asks for $87.1 billion for the Department of Health and Human Services. That's 12% less than the previous year. But whether that qualifies as the slash Castro described is a matter of personal opinion. Castro's tweet doesn't identify any specific healthcare programs, but it does link to an article from the Washington Post that highlights the budget's proposed impact on Medicare and Medicaid. The Post, like other media outlets and several lawmakers, reported the budget will reduce Medicare spending by $845 billion over the next 10 years. But as the Nonpartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget points out, that's not really a fair representation of the proposal. The CRFB says in reality, cuts would more likely fall between $500 billion and $600 billion, and that a majority of those savings would come from reductions in payments to Medicare providers, not a reduction in benefits. But where Castro's statement really goes awry is tying the healthcare cuts to tax cuts. The idea that government spending cuts compensate for federal tax cuts makes some sense, but there's no direct link between the Trump administration's Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and the proposed healthcare cuts, something experts confirmed to our partners at PolitiFact. But there's another caveat to consider. The president's budget won't become law as is. The budget he delivers to Congress each year is more like a giant wish list. Lawmakers ultimately write and pass the country's budget, though it does need the president's signature.
And of course, you had a number of medical institutions that cut tens of thousands of medical field workers, such as nurses, healthcare assistants, even doctors, and volunteers to the medical industry because they were not vaccinated. And just a year prior to that, they were deemed heroes for saving the healthcare industry when the influx of patients came in. And these mandates started to become improvised as time progressed, which led to the release of these heroes just 12 months prior to suddenly become vilified by the very institution and state in which they worked for, saving the healthcare industry. In which, because of these firings and new hirings, the healthcare institutions in this country, and we're talking statewide, saved hundreds of millions in regards to giving health care to these people, giving their salaries. And when hiring new people, these salaries were lowered as they're just starting new. Thereby, the CEOs of major healthcare institutions and hospitals, of course, they don't suffer the same fate financially. Their budgets are usually increased. When it comes to education and how decreasing budgets are impacting student learning and achievements, in an article by the School of Education online programs, school funding issues are indeed a major problem with direct links to student achievement levels. Schools with smaller budgets, which often can't offer as small classes or better programs, see lower student achievement, creating a system-wide socioeconomic backlash in education, a recession of sorts. And to fully understand how inequality in education is impacted by school funding, it's important to note how public education is funded in the first place. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities reported that 47% of school funding comes from the state. And a lot of people out there say, public education is a federal institution. It's the state institution. Now, yes, the state does ask for federal spending. However, it's not as black and white. Now, 45% comes from local governments. Meanwhile, the rest comes from the federal government, but each state is different, you see. School funding in Alabama is not as dependent on the government as, say, New York or California, which are indeed much more financially able than, say, a majority of the red states. The richest states in the United States are Democratic states, with New York, California being the 1 and 2. Now, all of these funds come primarily from taxes, both state sales and income, and property taxes, because property tax rates differ by neighborhood, and schools in wealthy areas with higher property tax bases receive more funding than those in poorer areas, which is what I outlined before when you compare it to like Alabama, which is a poor state, compared to New York and California, which are the richest states in the United States. Now, this inequitable amount of spending per school directly leads to disparity in economic achievement, according to the studies by the Center of American Progress, as well as Albert Shanker Institute and other institutions that have done these studies, which show a large disparity between state and federal spending to certain districts, school districts in certain states. Now, we had education reform in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s that fought to end this disparity. But new laws and court orders forced states to raise the amount of funding for low-income districts to meet that of higher income ones. Now, according to the American Economic Journal Applied Economics, the 1990 Kentucky Education Reform Act required states to increase low-income district budgets by $1,200 per pupil per year. And this would reduce class sizes and add to instructional spending. Now, former Secretary for the Department of Education, Betsy DeVos, who 3 years ago went before the Appropriations Subcommittee and asked to justify a proposed $9 billion cut to education. Listen.
As you know, the budget calls for $9 billion in cuts to the Department of Education. Just a point of clarification, is this your budget? There was some discussion about whether this was an OMB budget or a US DOE budget. This is your budget?
This is our budget working in concert with OMB.
Okay, and in the budget, in several places, it states that the programs that are cut to the tune of $9 billion could be supported by, quote, other federal, state, local, and private sources. But this is contrary to the evidence. As you likely know, state funding for education has been declining at all levels, state, county, city, and I know you know that there is not private foundation money to the tune of $9 billion a year. So how are we going to come up with $9 billion, or do you think there should be $9 billion less spent in education overall?
Well, sir, I think that the approach to the budget was to make some tough decisions and recognize the fact that money is not limitless and respect the taxpayer. And
but that's not what you say.
We have gone.
Hold on one second. That's not actually what you say. You said the programs that are cut could be supported by federal, state, local, and private sources. You do not say that we're in a constrained fiscal environment. We'd like to spend more if we could. It seems that there's sort of two ways to approach $9 billion worth of cuts. One is we want to make $9 billion worth of cuts. We think this is in the best interest of public education and private education because we think the federal government should play less of a role and the burden should shift to the private sector and to local DOEs. That's one philosophy. The other is we don't have enough money. If we could do more, we would do more. Now, what philosophy are you articulating in this budget?
Some of the programs that have been recommended for scaling back or cutting are duplicative. Some of them are ineffective, and some of them could better be supported by state, local, or philanthropic efforts.
Do you include the cut of 40,000 teachers federally funded in that category called duplicative or could be supported by some other entity?
I don't know exactly what 40,000 teachers you're referring to, but if you're talking about the teacher training program, that
No, I'm talking about Title II, which
Title
funds
2A.
40,000 teacher salaries.
for reducing class sizes, is that what you're trying to suggest? Those funds have been used for a broad range of teacher initiatives. They
But
have
they
been,
mostly
they
go
have
to-
been, they
Okay,
have
go
been,
ahead.
they have been very thinly spread. And in many cases, like 20% of the cases, the funds are less than 10% or $10,000 to a school. And so there's not been an effective and there's not been evidence of great outcomes or effectiveness from this program.
Have you talked to
And
principals about
and
how
through
much
Title
$10,000
I
Hold on.
funds?
Have you, I have limited time.
If I,
Have you
I know,
talked-
but if I could just
Well, why don't
continue
I
on
take
to
your-
talk
I-
about the implementation of ESSA allows for great flexibility in the states to target resources to effective teacher training programs and teacher improvement programs. So
But this
there's
goes
a
back
lot
to
of
what-
opportunity to use them to enhance
Okay, I
teachers'
really do have
effectiveness.
limited time. This goes back to what former Governor Shaheen mentioned, which is that you are imagining revenue, not in evidence. You are imagining flexibility that does not exist at the local level. So to say that, for instance, 21st Century Learning Centers or what's happening in career and technical education or these dollars that support 40,000 teachers across the United States, to say that, well, you know, that'll be handled by the private sector, that'll be handled through increased flexibility. You reduce the flexibility that education systems have by reducing the funding that they have. And it's a sort of rhetorical device to say they will be basking in new flexibility. But anybody who's run a government or anybody who has run a school doesn't want flexibility, they want resources. And what you're doing is cutting them massively.
Not only does it just appear in the current period, but New York advocates recently slammed New York City Mayor Eric Adams, who proposed education budget cuts to the state. Listen.
On the steps of Tweed Courthouse, parents, students, and advocates are calling for more equity in education.
The preliminary budget outlined by Mayor Adams was basically cutting $1 billion from our schools. We find that completely unacceptable.
The group says now is not the time for cuts when students are 2 years into a pandemic. New York City Schools Chancellor David Banks shared his vision for transforming the school system this week.
The vision for a bold and supportive and equitable New York City needs to be designed by young people and their families, not, bureaucrats at the top of the system.
What they're calling for is fewer police in schools and more resources in the classroom, like culturally responsive education, smaller class sizes, and mental health services.
It's even more outrageous that my brother, who suffers from serious depression, cannot find the support that he needed in his school. That's like having a squad of soldiers and no field medic.
The group also says that while their suggestions do align with most of the ideas in Adams' education plan, they claim they do not go far enough.
We have to divest from things that are steeped in white supremacy. We have to divest from the criminalization of children, and we have to invest in them.
The coalition is also calling for inclusive learning environments so that the most vulnerable students, they say, are prioritized.
Now, the problem with this is that what they're learning in the classrooms, all right? This is repetitive learning, not creative learning. There is no creativity in learning and education today. And we saw a regress of individual thought learning, creativity, that goes back to the Ford administration in the 1970s. And I went to school in New York. And I could tell you that they barely spent any money in the public sector, public schools. private schools, they don't get money from the federal government. They get it from the state, as well as individuals who, rich individuals who actually spend a good amount, and they get their name in a plaque or something, and get their name inscribed in the halls of the school. But the public education itself is a degradation of the mind. And I'm not going to get into that. This is not about what they're learning. But in regards to like New York City schools don't use their portion of, say, the $350 million to hire full-time staff, since it's temporary funding. Right? Now, they have a problem spending this money because it's temporary funding. Now, principals can spend it on part-time staff in certain areas, such as for art classes. But officials have urged schools to use funding increases outside of COVID relief to hire more staff if they need. And it's unclear how much money city schools have spent. The department spokesman said it's too soon for the school to provide spending data per year. But, when you have the principals union, which exclaimed as of recent that the high percentage of schools have struggled to earmark all of their relief dollars, in which he hopes that the city will provide more flexibility, in which the head of the union remarked a lot of schools feel they're going to end up giving money back. And of course, what does this lead to? Well, it leads to teacher burnout and less of a student turnout. Now, we just are now, because it's an election year, of course, starting to have these mandates relaxed a bit. So you have a lot of people, especially principals in the public schools, who remark that they're not servicing as many kids as they would have liked. And that the money, the temporary funding that the public schools are getting, they can't spend it all before the deadline. But what can they do? The teachers are spending money out of pocket to buy things like markers, notebooks, because certain school districts get a certain amount of money. Now, when you get these teacher unions to speak on behalf on certain school districts, that means everybody has on the same page. But if somebody is acting outside of those limits, then that person could be seen as a wild card, and maybe school funding will not be beneficial to that one person or to that principal. There's a lot of brown nosing and a lot of bureaucracy when it comes to the Department of Education. Let's talk about a real epidemic, homelessness. Now, according to a CNBC article, more than 500,000 Americans are unhoused, and the United States is struggling to solve the homelessness crisis. Now, of course, due to the COVID pandemic, which caused a surge in housing costs and a rise in unemployment, which now have 600,000 Americans homeless as of the current year. With California, #1. Now, this is the irony of the blue states. Even though they're the richest, they are experiencing the most homeless. Now, at the same time, New York and California have millions of people. They're big states. Nevertheless, they're experiencing the most homeless. Now, are these homeless transients, meaning people from other states are going there? Or are they residents? Well, a large percentage, according to the article, are residents. And according to the National Alliance of Ending Homeless, in the 2021 edition, California had 161,548 homelessness people. That's 40% per 10,000. New York is number 2 with 91,271 people homeless. Number 3 is Washington, 22,923 people. And at number 4, Oregon, 14,655. With Arizona at 10,979 at number 5. The states that are not experiencing as much homeless rates are the red states. For the exemption of Texas, which is the largest state in the country, 27,229. And when you compare that to, say, California, Texas has 9 people homeless per 10,000, where California has 40 people homeless per 10,000. Ridiculously high number. So, what does this mean? Now, overall, according to the World Population Review, 66% of the total homeless population of the United States are single individuals, with 33.3% being families. In recent years, homelessness increased nationally by 1%. The number compromises unaccompanied children and young adults, single adults experiencing chronic homelessness, and people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. Some populations have seen a decrease in homelessness, but dramatic reductions are amongst families and the veteran community, which offer more benefits for single mothers with children and, of course, veterans of the military. Single men compromise the most. And another alarming statistic comes from New York City. In recent years, homelessness in this city reached the highest levels since the Great Depression in the 1930s, reaching its highest point under Mayor Bill de Blasio, a bloated oligarch. However, this year saw the second year in the decline of the homeless or unsheltered populations attributed to the creation of safe havens or specialized shelters. Now, on the flip side of that coin, what states like New York do is that they ship homeless people. They give them a bus voucher and $100 or $50 and ship them wherever out west. So it's not as black and white as people make it seem. And these are absurd numbers. And, you know, I will submit to you that we can either speak out against government corruption, malfeasance, and willful ignorance of its constituents and abuse their civil liberties and commit mass murder in the name of democracy abroad. Or we can sit here and fight on viral media about supporting the wrong party. Now, if I have to relate to you about the problems regarding the isms, the human constructs of religion, politics, racism, sexism, which are all divisive properties. If I have to argue with you, or do I have to relate the obvious to you, you are still a victim of this matrix that was created for you. I'm using the matrix as an analogy. You are being led to believe that you yourself are the enemy to each other, when I'm trying to tell you that the enemy are the people who made you think this way in the first place. Now, I'll go back to Veronica Degrade, who's a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, in which I will provide the article below, in which she states the following, quote, "What about the idea that we should annually spend 4% of our GDP on defense, as opposed to the 3% we are now spending? I find this argument lacking. As a measure of economic activity, GDP has very little to do with our ability to defend ourselves. There's no reason for 3%, 4%, or any other portion of GDP to be considered the right number. If the defense spending to GDP measurement reflects anything, it's affordability. That brings us to our enormous budget deficits and resulting growing national debt. Unless Congress cuts non-defense spending significantly, growing the military budget will grow the deficit. However, if additional defense spending is deficient financed, then we can expect slower growth. As Harvard economist Robert Barrow and I demonstrated in a study back in 2013, that reduces, not increases, the affordability of our defense budget. In other words, let's make sure we're asking the right questions before rushing to jack up the defense budget. I think it's high time we start asking the right questions, and not along party lines, but as a unified human community